Is there a Catholic way to look at the contentious issue of immigration? Stay tuned for the Roundtable and find out.
Ave Regina Caelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve radix, salve porta, ex mundo luces orta, cade Virgo gloriosa.
Welcome to the EWTN Theology Roundtable. I'm your moderator, Colin Donavan, Vice President for Theology here at EWTN, and we are here to discuss the issue of immigration. I'm joined by one of our newly ordained friars, Father Leonard Mary Revilla, and two members of the Theology Department, Lett and Cindy Cuellar. The Church's teaching, social teaching, gives us many principles of action in society, of social action in society. And among them is the rights of states to protect their borders and the rights of human beings to immigrate to provide for their family. This creates a question of how to bring these rights together, to bring these teachings together, these principles, and find ways to both, on the one hand, regulate immigration, and on the other hand, be just to those who are seeking to livelihood in order to provide for their families, or safety, or for some other thing that they cannot find in their native land. And so today in politics, this is a great issue that has been discussed. It's been the subject matter of Supreme Court cases, one of which is decided, and probably others en route to the Supreme Court, as well as a great deal of discussion in the political sphere and in the society at large. So it's an important subject to know about, but it is one that we have to realize that the Church's mission is to teach regarding the principles, and insofar as those principles give us secondary principles of action regarding those as well. Whereas the matter of policy, of reconciling the principles and developing policies that are suitable for a particular culture and society, follows to those laity who have the political offices and depending on the form of government, kings, presidents, legislatures, parliaments, congresses, and so on. And so this is not that we can decide here, or the Church can decide what a particular legislative solution is. But she can say what the principles are, and she can say that there are clearly applications that ought to be made, and there are other things that not ought to be done as being unjust. And so we'll want to talk about that today. The Catechism, for its part, says in paragraph 2246, "It is part of the Church's mission to pass moral judgments even in matters related to politics whenever the fundamental rights of man or the salvation of souls requires it. This means, the only means she may use are those which are in accord with the gospel and the welfare of all men, according to the diversity of times and circumstances." And in 1923, political authority must be exercised within the limits of the moral good and must guarantee the conditions for the exercise of freedom. So we have these two polarities, if you will, between the principles of justice and of the gospel on the one hand, and the rights and duties of nations and individuals, and all of these must be reconciled in policies that are, in the best and ideal way, satisfying all of the values that are involved. I think starting out, it would be important to look then at some of the fundamental values and principles that underlie the various questions involved. And so I think we can talk about, certainly we acknowledge that God is a creator, and that really in a true sense, only He is the absolute owner of everything that there is. So that raises a question: how is man in relationship to the goods of the earth, and what is it that he should be considering when talking about this? Now we know, Cindy, that man, made in the image of God, has a certain role in God's governance of the universe, of creation of the earth, and therefore of goods, property, and so on in this world.
Yes, we began, Colin, with Genesis chapter 1, verse 26a, where God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So when we look at the creation account in the first chapter of Genesis, we can see that man is unique because he is the only one that is created in the image and likeness of God. And even though man is fallen, he still has a dignity of the image of God. And this is evident because God became a man and not an animal for our salvation. And if God upheld the dignity of man in this way, how can we treat men as if they were no more than animals?
And of course, this has important consequences then for the goods of this world. On the one hand, there is the attitude we should have towards man because of his dignity, made in the image and likeness of God. And on the other hand, there is a responsibility that we have for the goods of this world to use it according to the divine will and not simply our own autonomous will.
Yes, Genesis 1:26b points out that God said, "Let man have dominion over all the earth and over all the fish and cattle of the sea," and so forth. The scripture also makes it very clear that man uses the goods of this world for the common good, not just for his own selfish good. An example of a verse on that would be like Jeremiah 27:5, where God says, "It is I who by my great power and my outstretched arm have made the earth with the men and animals that are on the earth. And I give it to whomever it seems right to me." So God has given man dominion over the earth to make use of its resources, not for selfish means, but for the common good of all mankind.
So man has this dominion. God is the Lord of everything, and therefore the final judge of and disposer by his providence. He gives goods to certain individuals. You know, we might say in a purely materialistic or humanistic fashion alone that, well, it's by circumstance that this person is rich or this person is poor. But in reality, the Lord is Lord of all of that. Right. And therefore, the stewardship of it, according to those he gives wealth, for instance, involves a discerning what the divine will is in the use of those goods in service of others.
Well, St. James says every good and perfect gift comes from the Lord. And God gives us everything we have, the food we eat, the air we breathe, the sun that shines on our face. And he calls us to use this wisely, to be responsible as individuals and as a community. We're called to till the earth, to work in the earth, and to preserve the earth. And everything God gives us, he asks that we use it responsibly, but of course show our appreciation at the same time. And that includes the things he gives us, how we live our lives, how we use our time and materials. Are we wasting things? And the Lord wants us to make good use of everything and to use everything for his glory.
That recalls to mind that something that our present Holy Father Benedict XVI has been sort of noted as the Pope of ecology, because he has recognized the responsibility we have. We don't, just as we don't have a right to take all of the Earth's resources and destroy them or dispose of them only for our selfish interests, we have to care for the water, we have to care for the air, we have to do all the things so that it's of use not just to us, but to further other generations. All of the goods of the earth, even the land on which we stand, is not ultimately ours, and we do have a responsibility to others. And this is a long-standing, Christian principle, really. I think of the play of Victor Hugo, Les Miserables, where you see the man who is starving, who steals a loaf of bread. In ordinary affairs, it would be called stealing. But he has a certain greater right to that bread, as is made clear in the course of the play, than does the person who made it, because although the man loses some income by the theft of that bread, the individual survives and his family survives because, and so life being a greater value than property, he had that right. Father, you have a particular experience in this regard. I think it would be helpful for our audience to know a little bit about your background and the perspective that you're coming at, not only as a priest with your theological and pastoral training, but as just a man.
Okay. Well, I come from East Los Angeles, California, and my ancestry is from Mexico. My parents, my grandparents immigrated here back in, I think it was around 1916, 1917, and they came in search for a better life. You know, tensions were high in Mexico.
This was the time of the Cristeros.
The time of the Cristero movement.
Movie out there right now.
So they came here to the United States and to raise a family and to to enjoy freedom. Yeah, and well, having grown up in Los Angeles, where there's a large Mexican population of immigrants who are both documented and undocumented, I was privileged to work with many of them, to go to school with them, and to live in the same neighborhoods as they were. And they're very great people. Hard workers at everything they do. Of course, you have your the few that take advantage of the system, but a majority, in my experience, were people who just wanted opportunity, wanted a chance in life, and that they could not get in Mexico or in any of the other Latin American countries. So they're here to take advantage of education and employment and just an honest way of living. Yeah.
And this is the hard part that I think in the immigration policy, because obviously we live in a difficult time with terrorism. We've got the drug lords in Mexico, Colombia, and elsewhere. And so there are legitimate reasons for being very concerned about the security of our borders. But at the other times, there are individuals such as you met and know who are not part of evil organizations or simply looking for the good of their families. And how do you reconcile these seemingly opposing values? How can you have a solution to one and yet a solution to the other? This is the trouble our political leaders face, very much often relying more on slogans and platforms rather than justice, and trying to apply the principles of the moral law. And in fact, that is the crux of the immigration issue, resolving the individual good and the common good. And so I think we need to talk a little bit about that. And one of the areas, Father, has to do with the fundamental principles that should guide government. Again, the church is not telling government an immigration law must contain this particular element necessarily, but she is giving principles about what would be positive elements and what, of course, would be negative elements of any immigration policy.
Right. Well, people, the church never says that a nation cannot have borders, first of all. But the church does require us to have charity, especially for those who are in need. And a lot of times, in most cases, many of the undocumented immigrants who come here are coming here because they're in desperation because of the dire and harsh living conditions they were in, and just seeking an opportunity just to enjoy life and have a better life for themselves and for their families. And this is really just about helping the person, seeing the dignity, the quality of every man, and doing what we can to provide for their needs.
And there are very many biblical examples of how this is both a value under the Old Covenant, when Israelites were told to be good to the stranger within their midst, and also in the church where our Lord Himself speaks of the neighbor as the person not necessarily who is even of your own nationality or race. How the Good Samaritan helps the man at the side of the road, even though the Samaritans and the Judeans were at loggerheads religiously, territorially, and otherwise. So these are very strong values. But the state, of course, also has its rights. We've talked about it several times now, the right to protect the borders and to affect the security, because I know from having, my parents lived in South Texas for a long time and had friends in Arizona, as I do. And so people along the borders very often live in danger, because not all immigrants coming into the country they may themselves be families seeking well-being, but they're brought by violent persons, by drug dealers and others who are exploiting them and using them to carry drugs in or do other things. So we have an important values of the common good of the state that need to be addressed as well.
To make sure our audience hears this, it's important to cite the Catechism note for that. It's 2241. It says, political authorities, for the sake of the common good for which they are responsible, may make the exercise of the right to immigrate subject to various juridical conditions, especially with regard to the immigrant's duties toward their country of adoption. Immigrants are obliged to respect with gratitude the material and spiritual heritage of the country that receives them, to obey its laws, and to assist in carrying civic burdens. It is important to recognize that the people that are elected or the government has a responsibility to protect citizens on both sides. You know, when you make laws for an immigrant, hopefully the laws are good for the immigrant and for the country that they come into. If the government's allowed to make laws that victimize the immigrants, how long before it actually will come to the citizen as well? We live in an age when people are inclined to think that the person in front of them that they see is the only way the government should make a decision. No, I need to let the government look at the situation in a way that I as an individual without resources cannot do. And the state has the right to make laws so that the immigrant knows how they can behave to become a good citizen.
And it really is true, as Jesus himself said, that, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God. So on the one hand, the state has the right to make laws, but then at a certain point there can be where that must give way to mercy, to charity. Yes. And so it's that balance. Again, we're back to the crux of the problem. How to come up with policies that have that balance between the right of the state protecting the common good of those who are already here, including previous immigrants, immigrants who went through a documentation process, immigrants who may come here only recently but did so legally. And so there are rights to be protected there. And then also illegal immigration, undocumented immigration, often creates crime and breeds dangers, as we talked about along the borders with the coyotes that bring people in, and sometimes they die in the deserts trying to get in. So there are a lot of values involved, and not all of them are simply just, well, we have a country, it's ours, we do with it what we want, let's put up a fence and keep people out. No, I don't think anyone really has that mentality, but they're trying to reconcile all of these things, which will in the end benefit the new immigrants as well, by protecting them from the forces that exploit them when they are brought into a country. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to look into this matter of the common good, so central to the issue, along with the dignity of the immigrant, documented or undocumented, and we'll see what more we can find out in church teaching about those two areas.
Ave Domina Angelorum, salve radix, salve porta, ex valum. Ave Regina Angelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, salve radix, salve.
Well, we're back, and we've been talking about the difficulty of solving the immigration riddle, of protecting the rights of those who are already here, Americans and documented immigrants, and indeed the rights and the dignity of the undocumented as well, and reconciling those. A starting point for consideration of that is the common good, because when you look at Catholic social teaching, the common good is a significant element. In fact, it's in a way, it's one of the pillars of Catholic social teachings. Because everything we have, of course, as individuals, we have our dignity, but when we interact in societies at different levels, whether it's the stamp club or in the city, the county, the state, or at the federal level or internationally, you can speak of a common good of each of those different levels of organization, of society, of community. And the Catechism defines common good as the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So it's allowing people to flourish humanly. Doesn't mean allowing people all to become doctors and lawyers and presidents of the United States or congressmen or something like that, but that according to each person's capability, that at least they have the basic necessities in order to flourish in society and take advantage of the opportunities that the society affords. And so that's true for everybody who is in this society. Cindy, there are 4 pillars of the common good that we find in church teaching. What are those pillars that ought to be guiding our thinking when we say, well, what must be protected in order to help the common good?
Well, the first pillar is really the one that stands at the center of the common good. And this is the pillar of life. That is the protection and dignity of every human life from conception to natural death. And the framework, this pillar of life, there is a framework within and against which every other issue must be measured. Now the second pillar is the prime...
Before you move on that point, I'm reminded of Cardinal Ratzinger's letter to the U.S. bishops in 2004, I believe it was, when he noted that there is a hierarchical of values where certain things are morally good or evil. Morally good, obviously, life and the protection of life. Morally evil, abortion, euthanasia, infanticide, these kinds of things. Whereas other things are insignificant, constitute good social policy, but are not as significant as the pillars. Now, the second one is one of those things that he had listed as being central to one's political considerations.
Yes, that's correct. The primacy of the family as the first cell of society. And that is the protection and honor given to the faithful marriage between a man and a woman and the family built upon it.
So this is something the church has insisted on in recent days especially, that the marriage of man and a woman is an institution of nature itself, as well as God, as the believer understands that, an institution of nature itself, which is a patently obvious fact.
Right.
This is the way new life is brought into the world. And so without life, without the family, you can't have life. So these are the first 2 of the pillars. What is the third pillar? The
third pillar is authentic human freedom. That is, and this includes the first freedom, religious freedom. An authentic human freedom is bound by truth and exercised within a moral framework.
So this is what our founding fathers understood, even though some of them were deists. In other words, they believed sort of generally in a supreme power or supreme being. And that's somewhat reflecting it in our founding documents in unclear or more general terms for God. But yet they recognize that without that Judeo-Christian moral foundation, the Republic of the United States of America would be unhinged from the guidance that it needs in order to exercise democracy fruitfully. And as the ancient Greek philosophers said, and they were students of the philosophers, the ancient Greeks understood when you unhinge a democracy from moral pinnings, it becomes tyranny. And that's why conscience, protecting of religious conscience, moral conscience, is central. And the fourth pillar?
Well, really, this is twofold. You have the principle of subsidiarity, which affirms the responsibility and authority resides at the lowest level that is necessary to achieve a particular end. And then the other part is the principle of solidarity. And this includes a preferential option for the poor among us and those who have no voice.
So the same consideration really, that on the one hand, subsidiarity guarantees that there is not a tyranny of the impersonal, of the bureaucratic, by removing solutions from the level at which they can be solved to a higher level removed from the situation, from the people involved in situations, so that the level of government or of an organization that can, the lowest level that can solve a problem is where it should be handled, for the sake of a human solution as opposed to a bureaucratic solution. And the preferential option for the poor, what kind of a society would we have if we didn't have a bond of charity with our neighbor and concern for our neighbor? This then, we can apply this to the situation of the immigrant, and we can look at the social, political, economic circumstances in which the immigrant, both documented and undocumented, bring to a nation. And I think sometimes we're not sort of hearing in the public discourse the view that the immigrant is actually, regardless of whether they're documented or not, can be a resource for the country, can bring something to the country.
Yes. You often hear a person say that immigrants only take away jobs. Well, I would challenge a person to ask whether the job the immigrant is taking away is one they're ready to go out of their house and sign up for. Often you see immigrants doing jobs for which an employer may not be able to easily get individuals locally to do the job, and like pick tomatoes or do other farm type labor. It's backbreaking and it's hard, but the immigrant's willing to do it for the sake of a better life for his family, where the local person is not. There's no reason why they should do that kind of work, because they can get other kind of work. So they can be a resource in the way that they do jobs that other people in the society won't do, or there are not enough of them to do. It's wrong to say that the immigrant can only be a burden on society. You look around you, I think you can see evidence that that's not the case.
And it's not like this is a new problem that today the issue is only, well, we need Mexicans to cut our grass or pick our tomatoes or something like that. In every age, this has been the situation. When the Irish immigrants came over, they were looked down upon, they took the menial jobs. In fact, some jobs they couldn't get because the signs that said no Irish need apply. So in every generation, the Italians who came to Birmingham to work alongside black people in the mines, because those were the most menial jobs in this society. And so in every age, that seems to be the case, that there is a certain degree of entry into the society economically, but it is for the newcomer an opportunity to take advantages of our opportunities that we have in the United States, that we're not limited by class or economic status. We can continue to grow and to develop.
One thing that's not often seen as a resource that's missed by a secular government is the fact that most of these immigrants are Mexican and they're Catholic, and they help bring a value for life that is forgotten in a technological society. You often see them taking care of their parents and grandparents in a way that's not commonly the case. By being a large group of people, they bring our politicians back to have to think about life issues, because presumably they're Catholic and they're going to be interested in whether life is protected in a Catholic way or not.
This sometimes makes them victims of exploitation, whether it's political or economic, doesn't it?
Yes.
Of an opportunism on the part of employers or even on the part of political parties to take advantage of the immigrant and to exploit them for their own ends. I think the church even has something to say about the treatment of immigrants and the exploitation of them.
Yes, the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, number 298, teaches, institutions in host countries must keep careful watch to prevent the spread of the temptation to exploit foreign laborers, denying them the same rights enjoyed by nationals, rights that are to be guaranteed to all without discrimination. At the same time, conditions that foster increased work opportunities in people's place of origin are to be promoted as much as possible.
And this is indeed part of the problem. And I think, Father, you have some experience dealing with people, how often it is the situation in their own country. They're exploited, they may be exploited, it's sort of a cliche, but there are people who are, in sweatshops, working undocumented, doing menial labor for low pay, basically in servitude of one kind or another. And often they're coming from conditions not dissimilar in their own country, and is the failure of development and the failure of law and the failure of justice in their own country that has brought them, sadly, to injustice sometimes even in our own country.
Right. Yeah, and as a result of these inhumane working conditions in industry and in business in different parts of Latin America and even throughout the world, these immigrants, of course, they flee to come to the United States, and they can't earn enough money. Sometimes very, very low wages where they could barely even support themselves, let alone a family. This forces them to live in to make up like huts. They go and gather wood from broken pallets or spare bricks wherever they can find, and they build their own homes. This has been going on in Mexico for years. There's villages in the hills and out in the country, in the rural areas, where there's no running water or electricity. They're still using outhouses, and when these people go into the cities and they'll walk miles to work, there's they're subject to these working conditions, and they're exhausting and tiring, 16 hours a day, 14 hours a day. And then there's a problem with just the environment. There's a lot of crime in Mexico and a lot of the Latin American countries. There are these drug cartels, and there's also different groups, mafia, for instance, and many of which are they kidnap young girls, and they force them into basically human trafficking or prostitution. They get them addicted to drugs, and then the women, these young ladies, become dependent on this drug, and they says, well, their bosses or whatever would say, okay, I'm not going to give you the drug until you go out and you do these things for me. You go and sell yourself and bring me back some money, and then I'll give you some more of the drug. So we see how their lives are threatened, and there are parts in Mexico and in other Latin American countries where you either become a drug trafficker or a prostitute, or else that's it. That's the only way to live. And that income, sometimes it's not the greatest income, but it's better than working in the industry where they make hardly anything. So given that they have these horrible working conditions, this unsafe environment, these poor living conditions, they come here in desperation for freedom, basically. And when they're here, they're very appreciative for what they have, for the freedom they have, and they give their best in their work, in the way they worship, and in just contributing to overall society in general, getting involved in community and things like that.
I think Archbishop Jose Gomez of Los Angeles has been one of the most balanced voices on this, and he had some comments that he made at the Knights of Columbus convention a year ago, August of last year, and I could summarize, I'm going to get a little quote here, but I could summarize it this way, is the immigrant, documented and undocumented, but especially the undocumented, they simply present us with a fact. Yes, it is insignificant how they got here and that, but as the fact of their presence here calls a charity out of us when they're sick, when they're suffering, when they're attacked, when they're exploited, that is irrespective of their legal condition. And one of the things, of course, the church is concerned about is that the undocumented, or that the church herself is not penalized for her service to the poor, irrespective of their legal status. But Archbishop Gomez said this: for Christians, empathy means seeing Jesus Christ in every person, and especially in the poor and the vulnerable. Jesus was uncompromising on this point. And of course, we could refer to Matthew 25 and how we will be judged on seeing Christ in the poor, in the suffering, in the imprisoned, and so on. He went on to say, immigration is almost always forced upon people by the dire conditions they face in their lives. They did this not for their own comfort or selfish needs. They did this to feed their loved ones. What wouldn't you do to provide for your loved ones, to feed hungry mouths, to give your children a better future? So yes, we have the drug cartels sending their people over, using immigrants as mules and so on for their drugs, gun running, probably even terrorism from other countries, from Islamic countries and so on. We have all of that going on, but we also have this fact, this moral obligation towards the poor present among us, regardless of that status.
Right.
And the church is very concerned that we give proper respect to them, even while also insisting on legality and on a process to become legal, or a process to be returned justly to their own country if that is the outcome in a particular case, and proper treatment while all of that is going on. And so that is, I think that is where the church is coming down. Again, as we've talked about, balancing these values, the rights of the state and to protect the common good of the society and of the individuals already present here, as well as the charity that we should have for our neighbor, regardless of who they are. And we'll be back to talk more about that after this break.
Ave Domina Angelorum, salve radic, salve porta, ex mundo lux est volta, cade Virgo gloriosa. Ave Regina Caelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, salve radic, salve porta.
Okay, we're back, and we've been talking largely about the difficulty of the reconciliation of the multiple principles involved in a just immigration policy. And it certainly is something that is very familiar to Catholic theologians in moral theology, that the further you get from the fundamental principles, the more difficult it becomes to resolve them. And that's why among people of goodwill, there can be different disagreements regarding on the exact character of a policy, the details of it. But the basic principles of justice and so on are things which the Church is giving us in her teaching, and which then will draw certain conclusions from us. And often I think it will be that it's easier to tell what is not consistent with the principles of justice than it is to tell what is consistent. And that's where those of goodwill can disagree among themselves as to the best practical approach to solving a particular problem. For instance, do we need fences and armies on borders, or can we resolve it in less visibly and otherwise intrusive ways? Those are political questions to be resolved by the political wisdom of our leaders, all the while recognizing that we need to secure our borders somehow. So those are questions that will be left to practical decision. So what we can discuss then is, from the positive side, what a just immigration policy would look like. And the U.S. bishops, of course, believe that we do need such a policy, that our current system has proven itself to be a failure in the last 40 years from the very fact that there are so many millions of undocumented immigrants in the country. And in many cases, especially in agriculture and other areas, they're absolutely necessary for the economy. But yet we don't give them legal status, or we can't for various reasons. And so there is a problem to be fixed. We need to come up with a solution that enhances our security, strengthens our economy, and supports our communities, and all the communities, including the Latin communities and so on. Cindy, when the bishops talk about this, and I know in some of their documents and in other commentary made by individual bishops and others, they've talked about 5 principles that a just policy or an immigration reform would have at their heart. Let's start off with the first couple of those.
Yes. The first one is that persons have the right to seek opportunities in their homeland. And
So that's Mexicans really have a right to find jobs, employment, and good living conditions in Mexico,
Yes.
in Guatemala, in Colombia, in China, whatever country the individual is immigrating from.
That's right. They have this right and conditions such that persons can work and support their families in dignity and safety. So that can't be overlooked.
And I think this has been talked about by our political leaders, that yes, we have a problem in this country, but it's also partly because Mexico has not, and other countries, has not solved long-standing social and economic issues, that there's still grave injustices being committed there against the poor, and the exploitation, the drug cartels, and these kinds, the prostitution and so on.
Yes, and the second principle is that persons have the right to migrate to support themselves and their families when they are unable to find work and therefore are unable to support their families at home.
And throughout history, we have seen this. We are all immigrants to this land, some from closer, some from farther. You know, all of my ancestors came from the British Isles, Ireland, Scotland. They came here for seeking opportunity, some for religious reasons, some for the potato famine and so on. But yet they were able to come here to do that. So other than the Native Americans, we're all immigrants who sought opportunity at one time.
Yes.
Noah, what are some of the other principles that should be concerned?
Well, the other principle I've mentioned before is the protection of borders, that no immigration policy should in the end result in the border of any country not being protected, that the citizens in the borderlands or elsewhere in the country are open to whatever dangers flow freely back and forth across the borders. This is not an insignificant point. It's quite an important point for both the country on the other side and the country, the host for these immigrants. I'm glad the bishop said this, because this often doesn't get played. They make it sound like it's something the Republicans only want to do, when the bishops are pointing out this is a part of justice.
Right, and obviously in the border states, this has been a great concern. You know, there can certainly reasons for criticism of the law here in Alabama or in Arizona, as the case may be, and bishops have made those criticisms. Certainly our own here, because they thought that their social ministries to the poor would be hampered, and that seems to be not an issue anymore, at least as far as I read the situation. But at the same time, it shows the recognition that you know, there are concrete issues here to be resolved. You know, if you live along the border and you're afraid of armed coyotes or drug runners coming through your ranch or into your state or into your city, whether it's, you know, Birmingham or Phoenix or Tucson or Los Angeles or wherever, then that has a tremendous effect on the existing community, and that has to be resolved.
We remember Saturday morning cartoons where the bad guys would try to get to the border before the posse caught them so they could be free. Well, we don't want that, you know. You got to have border protection.
And in the past, it wasn't so much necessary. I think we all understand in a world where there's terrorists that this is something that has to be addressed. Father, what would be another principle that needs to be considered here?
Oh, we have to consider, of course, refugees and those who are seeking asylum, and just that they need a place to be protected, a place of safety, and basically a place to live. They need their rights as human beings, as individuals to develop, to have an opportunity, and yeah.
Well, and we think of a country like the Sudan,
Yes.
where there are great populations on the move fleeing from violence, as those being refugees. But as you noted, if all your neighborhoods are crime-ridden, drug-ridden, your daughter's being forced, you're a refugee. You
That's
have
right,
to
yeah.
move somewhere else. So it may hurt our feeling as Americans that we have people in our country who are refugees from that kind of violence, as in Sudan or other places. And of course, we have political refugees from most countries where there's not freedom. But it's still a fact. It's just the circumstances are different. It's not the armies in the Sudan chasing them. It's the drug lords. It's the others, the criminal organizations that have driven them out of their own countries. The final of the principles is human rights and human dignity of all persons, including undocumented immigrants, should be respected. This is a basic Christian principle that I would hope that no Catholic, no Christian would deny in terms of favor of their own self-interest, that regardless whether the person is a criminal, there is a certain basic human kindness and charity towards them. Certainly towards their salvation, that's the ultimate thing, but also towards their material well-being, and the gospel has sufficient examples of that in the Good Samaritan.
You mentioned Alabama law. There was the concern about the law our state was considering that would seem to make the priest a criminal who went to an immigrant who was undocumented and provided last rites, because that would have thought or to give a little food to a family while he was there for this, they would make that a criminal offense. That's obscene to think that.
Right. And as it turned out, that doesn't seem to be what the law meant, but still, not only the Catholic bishops, but other clergy who have outreach to the poor from other denominations also were concerned about that. But I think that danger has been defanged, at least hopefully. But it is a great concern for the church, because the connection between our faith and the charity that we should have. As I mentioned, the Gospels are filled with that, the Old Testament as well, charity for the stranger in your midst. And so it's part of our faith to do that. We can't be true to our faith not to do that, regardless if a government orders us not to do it. I think one of the things, as I noted, it's difficult to say specifically what a policy should be. It's easier somewhat to say what it would be contrary to justice. But yet there are 6 things, Noah, that have been talked about as, you might call them 6 outcomes that would be desirable of any immigration reform or policy that would help correct economic and social inequalities in the current immigration situation. What are a couple of those?
The bishops say that any policy that's put on the table are not result in an employer being unable to employ immigrants if that's all they can get to do is work. You know, the law shouldn't say, oh, you can't have them work because they're immigrants. No, if any law are to allow the use of people who want to work for jobs that other people are unwilling to take. Number 2, it ought to allow for just wages, and not say we could only have everybody getting 15 cents across the board and not allow the individual employer to give more. Normally we think of the employer as giving too little, but a Christian-minded, Catholic-minded person might want to give a fair and just wage, and that might be a danger to some people in other places, because they say, if you give that to your people, my people are going to be wanting this, you know.
Well, this gets to the whole root of what's sort of a gray or even black economy, in that the undocumented can be exploited and be paid, several dollars a day for work that others might be getting the minimum wage in a factory or something like that. And so it's absolutely to the benefit of the undocumented to be documented, because then the law protects their rights and they have legal recourse. So it's not desirable that they're not documented. And there was a point that was mentioned in our earlier discussions preparing for this, and that is that although we have in our immigration laws quotas for skilled individuals in different computer industry, technological industry, there's something like only 5,000 slots for people to do the kinds of jobs that millions of our undocumented are doing. Obviously, have documented openings in positions working on ranches, in construction, in farming, in other agriculture areas which have these needs, but not for highly skilled workers, even if it means work during this growing season and then go home to your families. That would be desirable for all. So this is an inequality that affects not only the country but also the undocumented, that it's simply not in their even in their favor for this status to continue as it is.
You had mentioned earlier how some of this is political football. The reforms in these areas don't happen sometimes because one political party or the other sees that if this passes, the other political party will get all these Hispanics voting for their people. And they're not thinking about the needs of the individual, but selfish party needs. And the bishop should call attention to this.
I think that's true in a lot of areas. There's so much emphasis put on maintaining a party orthodoxy when there should be a concern for maintaining Catholic orthodoxy.
Yes.
The party has no orthodoxy if it's not based on principles. It's simply selfish interest. And so there should be animated by charity. And that is what is sometimes lacking in politics across the board. Now, granted, there are very virtuous politicians. I'm not trying to slam all politicians. There are very virtuous men serving the common good in politics, but sometimes these issues do get manipulated.
Yes.
Well, since we're running out of time, I want to quickly mention these other outcomes. To require unauthorized immigrants already living in the United States to apply for legal status. Again, it's in our country's interest, it's in their interest to be legalized, to be regularized, to become documented. The fourth, to build a more flexible and responsive system for temporary and permanent employment. Well, this gets to the employment issue again, that if there is flexibility, then the government can legally regulate these areas where now there's gray economy, undocumented status, and so on. 5, support innovation and entrepreneurship and allow those who want to contribute their skills and talents to the country an opportunity to do so. Well, that's a general thing that the whole country needs, that the poor have opportunities to rise, to grow in status. Since we don't have classes in our country, our classes tend to be economic, but they're ones you can rise out of if you're persistent and the opportunities are there. And 6, finally, address the delays and restrictions that impose unreasonable waiting times on hardworking families seeking to join close relatives. So the church is very concerned about this issue of the family, and if you have legal immigrants in the country and they want to bring the grandmother here so they can care for her, to make that quickly possible and not bureaucratize it and make it a very trying process to bring over those in your family who need assistance and help as well. There's another area, and this I think can be our final point today, that goes along with our concern for the liberty issue that the church has expressed. The ability of the church to carry out her social mission because it's tied to the faith. Father, would you conclude with your thoughts on that point?
Well, first of all, Christ himself was fully God, fully man. And being that he was human, he can really empathize with our weaknesses and sympathize with us. And the church herself is kind of like an immigrant. Beginning with the apostles and other missionaries, we've gone to various countries and have been treated harshly at times. So the church can empathize with the immigrants, and that's why the church works for the dignity of any immigrant or documented, undocumented, and the church asks us to reach out in love. And the love of Jesus Christ who came and who died for all men. We see it throughout the scriptures, him reaching out to the Gentiles who were a forbidden people to the Israeli nation, and yet he went throughout giving love to everybody. And he teaches, love your enemies, love all those who persecute you. And this agape, selfless love is what he's called us to do. And someone who's a good example of this is Mother Teresa. This charity of seeing Christ in our neighbor. Yeah.
And that's so important, because that is at the heart of the gospel message. It is not just justice, but it is justice infused with charity. And so our laws must be infused with charity, even while they require that we obey them, or at least obey them when they don't violate justice and truth. And so that has to be the consideration at the heart of the immigration issue. And it is certainly difficult to find solutions, but we must continue to pray and to work politically to bring into effect just immigration policies that serve both our nation as well as the immigrant among us. God bless.
Ave Regina Caelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve radix, salve porta, ex mundo luces volta, Cade Virgo gloriosa, super omnes speciosa, Vale o vale de cora, et pro nobis Christum exora.
Dignare me laudare te, Virgo sacrata.
Dammici virtutem contra hostes tuos.
Oremus, concede misericordias Deus fragilitate